Castlevania Lords of Shadow is an interesting game. I first played it around the time it came out back in 2010, and I was turned off by the awful PS3 framerate and how drastically different it was from other Castlevania games. The gameplay was very similar to God of War, and by this time I was pretty burned out on the formula from playing so many games that were similar. I put this one down not too far into it, thinking that it just wasn't for me. That wasn't until I saw that it had released on PC with a cleaned up framerate and a 90% discount. How could I say no to giving it another whirl? You play as Gabriel Belmont. Fighting for the Brotherhood of Light, his mission is a clouded one. The dead are unable to pass on, trapped between worlds, and many believe that a dark power is at hand. After speaking with his recently deceased wife, he finds that the Lords of Shadow are at fault, and there are two masks in play, the God and Devil masks. The God mask has been fragmented, and the pieces are currently being held by the Lords of Shadow. This mask is said to have the power to resurrect the dead, and motivated by the possibility that this power could bring back his dead wife to him, he sets off on his quest to gain power and free the souls of the lost to allow them to pass on to the afterlife and stop the evil at work. Gameplay is what you would expect from a character action game of this type. You attack with the face buttons and have the ability to dodge and block. Blocking at the correct moment will initiate a parry and open your opponent up to a jolly good thrashing. Combos work by performing actions in certain ways, but sadly don't offer up enough variety. You can unlock more by purchasing them from the skill book, but it doesn't really amount to much more than just mashing or holding a button. There's very little overlap between light and heavy attacks, so the combat can feel a bit limited. You do, however, gain two different special forms that open up your moveset further. The blue aura allows you to heal when you attack, as well as giving you holy light style moves and a few crowd control skills. The red aura allows you to do increased damage and stagger enemies, as well as opening up powerful moves that hit hard. Both forms have their advantages in combos, as well as some pretty cool super moves. The main thing you'll be doing in combat is trying to focus on parries and trying not to get hit, because enemies attack hard and fast and your health doesn't recover between levels. You need to dodge unblockables and parry as often as you can, because in order to build up the energy levels of your special forms, you need to find orbs. You only get these orbs either by finding a statue that allows you to fill your meters, or by killing and comboing enemies. Killing an enemy will give you very few orbs if any, so comboing is where it's at. It's very hard to keep a combo going because you will get slapped from every angle, but when you pull it off, it looks and feels fantastic. Parrying gives you a huge combo meter bonus and slows down the action, so if your timing is good, you can parry an enemy and lay a bunch of hits into him to gain a ton of orbs, keeping you in your special forms to further wreak havoc. You're constantly switching styles to either heal or break guards or just have a little more crowd control when things get out of hand. The combat starts slow and sluggish, but after only a few moves added to your roster, you'll be pulling off flashy combos and feeling like a parry god in no time. I wish I could say the same about the rest of the game. It's pretty good for the most part, but the story is a little weird at times. It gets the job done, and Gabriel definitely comes off as a human being who means to do good, but is haunted by the darkness in his dreams. The voice acting all around is pretty good, and we even have Patrick Stewart reading us bedtime stories in between chapters. The cinematography is pretty good, and it follows the action in some neat ways. It can feel a little too gamey at times, and you really feel it in things like the special kills and the repetitive long animations. Opening a door can take forever, especially when it requires 4 QuickTime events. Exploration is done in a light platforming kind of way. You can hang from ledges, break doors, ride beasts, that sort of thing. The environments look incredible, and there's a lot of really nice camera angles highlighting the mountainous views and large architecture. You run around looking for items to expand your health and magic meters while you're on your way to your objective, but there's a lot of wall climbing and whip swinging, and some of the areas are just the same action over and over again. QuickTime events just bog down the pace. Almost everything you do to progress has some sort of button prompt that usually takes a few presses. What's kind of annoying is how a lot of the levels have areas you can't reach the first time through. You typically need a power-up that you only get much later into the game, so they incentivize you to replay the levels. It's unfortunate because this is a pretty long game, so in order to get everything, you'd need to spend a fair amount of time going back to fully explore previous areas. Thankfully it's not required, just useful if you need a little extra firepower. After initially struggling with the early game, Lords of Shadow really comes around in the back half. By this time you have more abilities and a large portion of your moveset, so it starts becoming really fun to fight things. The enemies are more varied and put up some pretty good fights. The bosses are decent for the most part, but aren't typically all that hard after you learn the trick to fighting them. The environments get a pretty big upgrade, and there's some genuinely good looking backdrops. The music takes a back seat though, and tends to just be some light orchestral tracks only amping up when the action is happening. The pacing of the game is all over the place, and you'll find yourself going from exploring mountains to fighting groups of zombies to playing chess? Okay. Well, there are a lot of light puzzles to do, and many of them require a lot of environmental exploration, which can be neat at times, but often frustrating. There's some pretty long checkpoints too, and you can find yourself in situations where you're repeating the same thing over and over, hoping for different results. The fighting especially can be pretty hard at times, and you'll need to do some quick thinking and enemy management to get through. I think overall Lords of Shadow did a pretty good job for what it was. While it certainly doesn't feel much like a Castlevania game aside from a few name drops here and there, it does play well and feels like a true journey as you visit new areas. Things can be a bit tedious, and it's unfortunately kind of a product of its time, where this genre was already somewhere on the downswing. It'd be nice to see a sequel try something a little different and iron out the kinks a bit. Something like Lords of Shadow 2. A follow-up to the first game, you again play as Gabriel, who is now the Prince of Darkness, Dracula himself. Taking place in more modern times, he awakens after a long slumber in a weakened state. Zobek returns from the first game to offer him a deal, true death to end his suffering if Gabriel will aid him in stopping the return of Satan. There are a group of acolytes trying to resurrect the devil, and it's up to Gabriel to regain his lost powers and fight the Dark King himself. This game plays very similar to the first. The movesets and the way combat handles is almost identical, the main difference being that everything feels faster and more dangerous. Fighting is easily the best part of this game and flows together very well after you unlock some moves. You once again have the blue and red aura to aid you, but this time around they're in the form of a sword and gauntlets respectively. The blue aura is ice-based and has the ability to freeze enemies and objects, and the red aura is fire-based and also has the added benefit of breaking armors and shields if the enemies are being too defensive. You'll use them a lot more in puzzle solving, although it doesn't get a lot more complicated than just match the colored aura when you shoot. Sub-weapons make a return, and this time around they're quite a bit different. You have the ability to throw knives and special projectiles, as well as use things like hourglasses to slow down time, or dodo eggs to help you find secrets. You even get healing potions, which can be pretty useful at times since there's no longer healing fonts. You can grab enemies in battle to drink their blood and recover a bit of health, but it's barely worth it outside of an easy kill. You also get access to some special moves like Mist Form to pass through gates, and you can turn into a rat to get through small tunnels. You spend a surprising amount of time as a rat, like way more than necessary really. Getting around areas is the same as the first game, but it just doesn't feel like as much of a spectacle. Sometimes you do some pretty cool things, but most time it just feels like generic platforming. I think it has a lot to do with the way the camera works. In the first game you had a lot of different angles, and when you were traversing environments it would regularly move around to show the action and pan out for expressive viewing. In the second game, however, the camera tends to try and center around Gabriel's back, and it just feels a little worse for it. You can still move it around, but there's rarely as much in the way in cinematic movement, so it just feels like you're constantly running down hallways. There's still some impressive visual effects at times, and overall the game looks great. It's just unfortunate that you spend a lot of time traversing the same areas, and when you're in places like the modern city, everything feels very similar and you get bored of running down the same streets over and over again. There's a fast travel system implemented in this one, as well as an item shop that you unlock early into the game. There's a ton of secrets to find, but just like the first game, there's a lot of places you can't reach until you have the appropriate power-up. One big change is the way you master weapon abilities. As you use unlocked moves in combat, you'll gain a percentage for said move, and when it reaches 100%, you can put it into your weapon mastery. Once the mastery level rises, you'll start doing more damage and your attacks will be a bit flashier. It's a neat system and makes it so that you'll try out new moves instead of sticking with the same ones over and over again. It's just a shame that some of the moves are so expensive, so unless you grind a little bit, you won't really see your damage increase, and it makes some of the mid to late game enemies a chore to fight. I guess I should probably talk about Mirror of Fate while I'm at it. I played the HD version, but this game originally came out for 3DS, and you can definitely tell with some of the cutscenes and stuff that they were trying to flex the hardware a bit. This game takes place before and after the first game, making it kind of a pre-sequel where you bounce around to different characters at different points of the timeline. The style of this game is that of a 2.5D Metroidvania, and it has a lot of good stuff going for it. The combat is pretty fun, and the comic-style cutscenes look great. The music is pretty good as well, but falls into the background for the most part, which is unfortunate because there's some good mood-building pieces that give a somber air. I'd say where it falls apart the most is in the exploration. It's a fairly by-the-numbers Metroidvania that doesn't do a whole lot outside of some pretty easy-to-find upgrades to your health and magic meters. You find yourself doing the same kind of platforming over and over again, and areas tend to only have one specific way through them. There is a fast travel system, but it's barely worth using unless you know exactly where you want to go. There's a lot of traps too, and they do a ton of damage. This isn't really a problem as the checkpoints are very forgiving, but sometimes you can get into trouble with them and end up wasting a lot of time. Some of the story beats are pretty jarring, and while it's cool to play as multiple characters, they ultimately all handle the same, and you're just going through the motions to get the upgrades you just had on the previous character, except they work slightly differently now. Some of the sub-weapons are pretty cool and have some good utility for wearing down different enemy types, but ultimately, combat just comes down to whacking enemies over and over again with your whip until it dies. If I had to recommend an order to play all the games, I would say do Lords of Shadow first, then Mirror of Fate, and finally Lords of Shadow 2. The reason being is that Mirror of Fate starts off with some pretty heavy spoilers for the first game, and a lot of the characters and things that are referenced here play out in the second game, making it kind of a stepping stone to get between games. I had a lot of fun playing these though. They've been on the back of my mind for a while now, and it feels good to finally finish them. My main complaint is just how tedious a lot of things can feel. You spend a lot of time running around levels looking for how to progress, and it's very easy to get turned around or miss a particular detail of the environment which will halt your progression. The story is hit or miss with some genuinely cool moments and some other laughable ones. Where the games excel is in the combat, where even though you feel a bit limited, everything just flows so well that once you know what to expect, you just feel like a god destroying everything around you. I feel like a lot of passion went into making these games, but it should have just been a side project called Lords of Shadow instead of being in the Castlevania series. It has enough going for it to stand on its own merits, and a lot of people will shame it just for simply carrying the Castlevania name. Both main games are fairly long and can be a bit of a slog at times, but if you can carry on and see them through, there's some really fun moments to be had. I mean, who doesn't want to be leader of the Rat Patrol?